Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The New South Creed. Before we discuss the so-called New South Creed, we should recall that the U.S. South was one of three regions of the nation until World War II. The other two were the industrializing areas of the Northeast and Midwest and the, quote, far west beyond the 100th degree west meridian, unquote. This was established as the West by John Wesley Powell's 1869 expedition and is the dividing line between the humid East and the dry West. This political map represents each area approximately in color blocks. The Union states in pink correspond to the Northeast and Midwest, with the exception of Kansas, Oregon, and California. The west of the states and territories west of that Minnesota to Louisiana line, mostly in brown, and the former Confederacy, to which the phrase New South pertains, is in green. Let me take a moment to explain the puce, that is, the purplish areas. Kentucky and Missouri were border states that the Confederacy claimed, but that never withdrew official representation from Congress. Indian Territory was divided in loyalty between the Union and Confederacy and were claimed by both, and the long Arizona Territory was disputed, having set up a Confederate government but being subdivided by the federal Congress at the 109th meridian, that is the current boundary between Arizona and New Mexico. Keep in mind that the area we'll discuss during this entire term is limited to the green states. Before we discuss the tenets of the New South Creed, let's talk about who proposed the creed. In doing so, we can see that it was not something set in stone, but an idea that many public men promulgated and shaped over time. I refer you to your reading, Birth of a Creed, which is Chapter 1 of Paul Gaston's 1974 book, The New South Creed, A Study in Southern Mythmaking. Gaston notes that the phrase New South was first used by a Union Army newspaper in Port Royal, South Carolina in 1862. Now, historians like to talk about firsts, but a first thing that fades away is not particularly interesting except as an oddity. The important thing is when something gets legs, as they say, and leads to more widespread adoption or effort. In the case of the New South, the first person to float components of the idea that were ultimately articulated as the New South Creed was J.D.B. DuBose of New Orleans. DuBose's Review was a very important proponent of Southern industrialization before the Civil War, and he resumed his crusade immediately following it. More voices than before picked up DuBose's words, but it was Edwin de Leon of South Carolina who used the phrase New South in the title of an influential 1870 article in Putnam's magazine. It wasn't only Southerners who talked about a New South. Pittsburgh businessman and Congressman William Pig Iron Kelly did a tour of the South in 1869 in which he called upon Southerners to lay aside cotton and embrace manufacturing. Kelly had been one of the founders of the Republican Party, and his daughter Florence soon became well known as an activist for child labor and women labor reform. Henry Watterson of the Louisville Courier-Journal was a proponent of the New South as well. Watterson's real contributions were to be both prominent and associated with the paper for 50 years, consistently pushing economic development and sectional reconciliation. His editorials were republished across the country, almost like the syndicated columns that came with the 20th century. Watterson was, according to his biographer Daniel Margulies, quote, one of the most important and widely read newspaper editors in American history, unquote, largely because of his longevity. But the most important purveyor of the New South Creed was Henry Grady, editor of the Atlanta Constitution from 1880 until his death in 1889 at age 49. In 1874, Grady published an editorial in the Atlanta Daily Herald under the title The New South. In it, he articulated the tenets of what came to be called the New South Creed. And as editor of the Constitution, he relentlessly promoted Atlanta as the center of that vision. In 1887, he successfully lobbied for Atlanta to be the site of the newly established Georgia Institute of Technology, an institution that summed up all of Grady's notions of what a New South should be. The thing that makes Grady stand out among other New South proponents were his speeches to Northern audiences, particularly his 1886 speech to the New England Club of New York. He was the first Southerner ever to speak to that audience. In those speeches, as well as his editorials, Grady articulated the tenets of the New South in two parts. The first was to recognize and denounce the Old South. That is, to some extent, Grady defined the New South by what it was not. The Old South had a labor system based on slavery, an economy based on cotton, and a politics based on planters. Grady maintained that these things were short-sighted. Quote, the Old South, he told the New England Club of New York, rested everything on slavery and agriculture, unconscious that these could ever give nor maintain healthy growth, unquote. Slavery was over, finished with the end of the Civil War, and good riddance. At that same speech, Grady said, quote, the old plantation was the only type possible under slavery. Thus was gathered in the hands of a splendid oligarchy the substance that should have been diffused among the people, unquote. His indictment was kind, and he recognized that the planter elite still held the New South in leadership, but they were only leaders, not the dominant arbiters of political power that they once were. Grady also articulated his vision of a New South that became the tenets of its creed. Growing alongside new industry was a sense of industriousness that Northerners had long claimed was missing among Southerners. Grady claimed, quote, we have fallen in love with work. We have let economy take root and spread among us. We have established thrift in city and country, unquote, all virtues that appealed to his 1886 Yankee audience. The New South was a place of wage laborers and yeoman farmers who had a great stake in the political machinations of their states. Grady again, quote, the New South represents a perfect democracy, unquote. All of this took place in the spirit of sectional reconciliation, especially in his magnum opus, his 1886 speech. Grady appeals to the better angels of his audience's nature by holding up Abraham Lincoln as the, quote, first typical American, unquote. Lincoln, said Grady, possessed, quote, all the majesty and grace of the Republic, unquote, because he came from, quote, the merging of the blood, unquote, of the original colonists, Southern Cavaliers and Northern Puritans. Grady also joked about General Sherman, calling him a, quote, able man, though kind of careless about fire, unquote, and after saying that he was glad that through war, quote, human slavery was swept forever from American soil and that the American Union was saved, unquote, he asked that his New England audience leave behind their wartime anger and not, quote, transmit this prejudice to the next generation, unquote. The last tenet of the New South Creed was ongoing white supremacy. This, too, was something that the former Union and Confederacy agreed upon, that African Americans were inferior to whites, and though the formerly enslaved, free people of color never really surfaced as a distinct group in the white mind, could vote, they were never going to be full citizens. In fact, leaving the fate of African Americans in the hands of white Southerners suited the powerful majority just fine, regardless of section, and that was part of reconciliation. Only part of what Grady articulated was more than a chimera. The South languished in poverty and extreme inequality, and continues to do so even today. How this happened and how it has changed is the main question of our joint investigation this term. So let me summarize. When we talk about the New South, we're talking about the states of the old Confederacy, from Virginia through Texas. That expands in the 20th century, but we'll get there soon enough. The New South was a vision constructed over many years by many contributors. We talked about 5, but there were others, each adding more and more bricks to the mythical edifice that became the New South Creed. Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution newspaper most thoroughly articulated this New South Creed through his columns, but mostly in a speech he gave to the New England Club of New York in 1886. The tenets he laid out, and that historians have distilled from that speech and other works, are that the Old South rested on an aristocracy steeped in the wealth that came from cotton and slavery. This system was indolent and was rightly overthrown in the Civil War. In its place, the New South arose. It was built on capitalist virtues of industriousness, thrift, and love of work, and it empowered yeoman farmers and wage laborers, as well as well-to-do planters and capitalists, to participate in politics. Furthermore, the New South yearned for sectional reconciliation, part of which rested on white supremacy and the desire of Southern whites to, as they might say, deal with the so-called Negro problem. Was this realistic? Of course not, at least not completely. At the same time that New South creeders were happy talking, a virulent lost cause mythology was emerging that, coupled with an equally virulent system of racial suppression, we call Jim Crow. That happy note, then, concludes this lecture. Thank you for your attention.